On that sticky tropical morning when March turned to its third day in 1943, Commander Hideo Kuboki found himself positioned on the command bridge of the destroyer Arashio, his eyes straining through the thick mist that clung to the surface of the Bismarck Sea. The air hung heavy with moisture and the acrid smell of oil that drifted up from the water below, where his exhausted crew members struggled to haul waterlogged survivors aboard, pulling them from the slick surface one by one. These men had been aboard the transport vessel Kyokusei Maru before American heavy bombers had sent her to the bottom the previous day. The convoy that Kuboki was helping to protect, designated as Operation 81 by Japanese command, had been tasked with delivering crucial reinforcements to the garrison at Lae on New Guinea's coast, and though they had already suffered the loss of that single transport to the high-flying B-17 fortresses, Kuboki and the other destroyer captains maintained their confidence that the most dangerous part of their journey lay behind them rather than ahead. Their destination waited just a few hours away, and the fighter aircraft stationed at Lae would surely provide adequate protection for these final stretches of ocean. Then, somewhere around the 10th hour of that morning, a lookout's voice shattered the relative calm with a single urgent word that would determine the fate of thousands of men. Aircraft were approaching. The formation that Kuboki observed materializing from the southwestern horizon bore no resemblance to any aerial assault he had witnessed throughout his extensive naval career. These were not the high-altitude B-17 fortresses they had confronted 24 hours earlier, those massive four-engine bombers that released their payloads from altitudes exceeding 5,000 feet, where the anti-aircraft batteries could at least make some attempt at engaging them. What approached now was something altogether different and infinitely more threatening. B-25. Mitchell medium bombers, accompanied by Australian-made Beaufighters, were racing toward the convoy at such minimal altitude that their spinning propellers seemed to be whipping the ocean spray into white foam. Their speed was tremendous, and they maintained their heading directly at water level in what appeared to be a meticulously coordinated assault pattern that would fundamentally transform how naval engagements were conducted throughout the Pacific theatre. Within the span of mere heartbeats, the precise amount of time required for a skip bomb equipped with its 5-second delayed action fuse to ricochet across the water's surface, Kuboki's entire world would dissolve into absolute pandemonium. His vessel would sustain crippling damage, her steering mechanisms completely destroyed, sending the Arashio into an uncontrolled spiral that would culminate in a catastrophic collision with the transport ship Nojima Maru. In barely a quarter of an hour, the entire convoy formation would be utterly annihilated. 7 transport vessels carrying 6,900 desperately needed soldiers would either be consumed by flames or sinking beneath the waves. 4 destroyers out of the 8-ship escort force would be completely destroyed or damaged beyond any hope of survival. This engagement represented far more than simply another convoy interdiction operation. This marked the pivotal moment when skip bombing, an innovative tactical approach developed under conditions of absolute secrecy by American military pioneers, would conclusively demonstrate that surface naval vessels could no longer operate with any degree of safety within the operational range of shore-based aircraft. Stepping backward in time to January of that same year, roughly 60 days before the shocking attack that would send tremors through the Imperial Japanese Navy, Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura stood within the command center of the 8th Area Army at Rabaul on New Britain, confronting a strategic situation that grew more desperate with each passing week. Allied military forces had successfully seized control of Buna along the New Guinea coastline following months of savage jungle warfare, and their attention now turned toward the critical Japanese installations at Lae and Salamaua. These military complexes functioned as far more than simple bases for operations. They represented the absolute foundation of Japan's comprehensive defensive architecture throughout the southwestern Pacific region, standing guard over the approaches to Rabaul itself, that fortress the Americans had taken to calling the Gibraltar of the Pacific, where nearly 100,000 Japanese servicemen maintained their positions. Without maintaining control of Lae, the Allied forces would possess an unobstructed avenue for advancing along New Guinea's northern coastline, eventually placing the Philippines within striking distance and potentially even threatening the Japanese home islands themselves. The stark mathematics governing warfare in this theatre permitted no ambiguity whatsoever. Every individual soldier, every weapon, every single grain of rice required transportation by ship from Rabaul across the dangerous expanses of the Solomon and Bismarck Seas. The physical distance amounted to merely 500 miles, yet given the rapidly increasing potency of Allied aviation forces operating from their bases at Port Moresby and Milne Bay, that distance might as well have stretched to 5,000 miles. Previous attempts at running convoy operations had already yielded results that ranged from marginal success to outright disaster. Earlier that January, specifically on the 7th day of the month, a convoy transporting the 102nd Infantry Regiment under the command of Major General Toru Okabe had managed to complete the voyage to Lai, though not without absorbing significant casualties along the way. An Australian Catalina flying boat had succeeded in sinking the transport Nichiryu Maru, sending all of Okabe's medical equipment and supplies to the ocean floor, along with 361 soldiers. Another transport in that convoy, the Miyoko Maru, had sustained such extensive damage that her captain had no choice but to deliberately run her aground. The price tag attached to reinforcing the New Guinea garrison was climbing to unsustainable levels. General Imamura understood with absolute clarity that decisive action could not be postponed any longer. Intelligence assessments indicated the Allied command was making preparations for a substantial offensive operation. Imamura needed to strengthen the Lai garrison with no less than a complete division if he harboured any realistic hope of maintaining that position against the coming onslaught. Following intense discussions with his staff officers and the naval commanders, an operational concept began to crystallize. Operation 81 would be mounted as a major convoy effort designed to deliver 6,900 fresh troops belonging to the 51st Division directly to Lai in one massive concentrated push. Everyone involved recognized the substantial risks inherent in such an undertaking. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself, the brilliant tactical mind who had orchestrated the attack on Pearl Harbor, issued a sobering warning that casualties might well exceed 50% of the embarked force. However, the alternative approach, which would involve landing the troops at some point farther along the coast and then marching them overland through hostile jungle terrain, would almost certainly result in even more catastrophic losses from tropical diseases, malnutrition, and persistent Allied airstrikes. The decision was finalized. The convoy would proceed with the operation as planned. The officer selected to command this vital mission was Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, who held command of the 3rd Destroyer Squadron. At 54 years of age, Kimura had established himself as one of the Imperial Navy's most seasoned destroyer commanders. His combat experience included countless nocturnal engagements in the Solomon Islands, where Japanese destroyer forces had consistently proven their tactical superiority over their American counterparts. The naval force assembled for Operation 81 was genuinely impressive in its composition. 8 of the Imperial Navy's most capable destroyers, every one of them a battle-tested veteran of the Guadalcanal campaign, would escort the convoy. The destroyer Shirayuki would serve as Kimura's flagship, leading the formation. Accompanying her were the Asashio, Arashio, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Shikinami, Uranami, and Asagumo, vessel names that struck genuine fear into the hearts of Allied sailors who had previously encountered them during night combat operations. But this particular operation would bear little resemblance to the rapid strike destroyer missions that Kimura had perfected throughout the Solomons, those lightning-quick supply runs the Americans had dubbed the Tokyo Express. For this voyage, his swift and maneuverable destroyers would be compelled to maintain formation with 8 plodding, defenseless transport ships loaded to capacity with soldiers and their equipment. The convoy's maximum sustainable speed would be restricted to merely 7 knots, scarcely faster than a running man could manage. For Kimura, whose tactical doctrine emphasized slashing through enemy-controlled waters at speeds approaching 30 knots, This crawling pace must have felt comparable to sailing with the anchor still deployed. Every additional hour spent at sea exponentially increased the probability of detection by Allied reconnaissance. Every mile covered during daylight hours represented an open invitation for air attack. Meanwhile, 500 miles distant at Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea, a markedly different variety of military intelligence was being applied to the strategic problem. Lieutenant General George Churchill Kenny, holding command of the 5th Air Force, had been wrestling with a challenge that had plagued his forces from the moment of his arrival in the theatre 6 months prior. The fundamental question was how to sink ships using air power alone. Conventional high-altitude bombing techniques had demonstrated themselves to be practically worthless against vessels capable of manoeuvring. During the January Convoy engagement, his bomber crews had flown 416 individual sorties and managed to send exactly 2 ships to the bottom, a thoroughly miserable return on the investment of aircraft, fuel, bombs, and pilot lives that would be completely unacceptable in any business enterprise, much less in warfare. Kenny grasped the reality that if he could not develop an effective method for stopping Japanese convoy operations from reinforcing their defensive positions, MacArthur's planned offensive advance along the New Guinea coast would inevitably deteriorate into a bloody war of attrition. Kenny did not conform to the template of traditional military thinking, however. Prior to the outbreak of war, he had cultivated something of a reputation as a maverick officer, constantly finding himself in professional difficulty for advancing radical concepts that challenged established orthodox doctrine. Back in 1928, while serving as an instructor at the Air Corps Tactical School, he had theorized about a bombing technique he called skip bombing, which involved releasing bombs from extremely low altitude so they would bounce across the water's surface like flat stones thrown by children and detonate against a ship's hull below the waterline. The concept had been dismissed by his superiors as excessively dangerous and thoroughly impractical. Now, with American forces desperate to interdict Japanese shipping operations, Kenny determined it was time to transform theoretical concepts into battlefield reality. The development process for skip bombing encompassed far more than merely solving technical challenges. It represented a complete revolution in aerial combat doctrine that required fundamentally rethinking every assumption about how bombers engaged ships as targets. Major William Benn, commanding officer of the 63rd Bombardment Squadron, became Kenny's primary experimental pilot for perfecting the technique. Through extensive trial and error testing, they discovered that the optimal attack profile required approaching at precisely 200 to 150 feet of altitude while maintaining an airspeed of 200 to 250 miles per hour. The bomb had to be released at a distance ranging from 300 to 600 yards from the intended target, and the munition itself required a 4 to 5 second delay fuse. If the aircraft flew too high, the bomb would not skip properly across the water. If the altitude was too low, the attacking aircraft risked destruction from its own bomb's blast effect or from flying debris thrown up from the target vessel. The margin for error was effectively non-existent. Kenny recognized that skip bombing by itself would not provide a complete solution to the problem. The bomber aircraft would require some method of suppressing the intensive anti-aircraft fire they would inevitably face during their low-level approach runs. This requirement brought another military innovator into the developing story. Major Paul Irvin Gunn, universally known by his nickname Pappy, was a 43-year-old former Navy pilot who had established himself as Kenny's preferred source for unconventional engineering solutions. Gunn had already achieved something approaching legendary status throughout the Southwest Pacific Theater. When hostilities had commenced, he had been working as a civilian airline pilot in the Philippine Islands. His family had been captured by Japanese occupation forces and imprisoned at the Santo Tomas internment facility in Manila, a personal tragedy that had instilled in him an absolutely burning desire for vengeance against the Japanese military establishment. Gunn's mechanical genius became the critical element in making skip bombing tactically viable and survivable for the air crews. Taking a standard B-25 Mitchell bomber as his starting point, He removed the entire bombardier's compartment from the nose section and installed 4 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns in its place. His modifications did not stop there, however. He added 2 additional guns mounted on each side of the fuselage and another 4 guns positioned underneath the aircraft, creating a flying weapons platform with absolutely devastating forward firepower. When Kenny first laid eyes on Gunn's modified B-25, which had been affectionately nicknamed Pappy's Folly by the ground crews, he immediately grasped its tactical potential. "Strip everything out of that nose section and pack it full of 50-caliber machine guns," he instructed Gunn enthusiastically. "I want you to attach more guns on the sides of the fuselage. Give me every bit of forward firepower you can possibly mount. I want a skip bomber that can completely overwhelm the deck defenses of a Japanese destroyer before it even releases its bombs." Throughout the entire month of February in 1943, the modified bomber aircraft practiced their new tactics relentlessly against the wreck of the SS Pruth, an old passenger vessel that had run aground off the Port Moresby coast back in 1916. Day after day, without exception, the B-25s would roar in at masthead height with their guns blazing continuously, their bombs skipping across the water to slam into the corroded hulk with remarkable consistency. The accuracy they achieved was genuinely remarkable, far superior to anything that could be accomplished through high-level bombing techniques. Practicing against a stationary wreck sitting on a reef was one thing, of course. Attacking an operational convoy consisting of warships manned by trained anti-aircraft crews and protected by fighter cover would be something entirely different in terms of difficulty and danger. The Australian contribution to this revolutionary tactical development cannot be minimised or overlooked. Number 30, Squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force, equipped with Bristol Beaufighter twin-engine fighters, had been developing their own low-level ship attack techniques independently. The Beaufighter, armed with 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns concentrated in the nose, was absolutely perfectly suited for the mission of suppressing shipboard defences. Group Captain Bill Garing, an RAAF officer serving on Kenny's staff who possessed extensive experience in anti-shipping operations from his previous service in the European theatre, proposed a comprehensively coordinated attack plan that would maximise the effectiveness of both aircraft types. The Beaufighters would initiate the attack at masthead height, using their concentrated cannon and machine gun fire to suppress anti-aircraft gun positions, followed immediately by the skip-bombing B-25s taking advantage of the suppressed defences. High-altitude B-17 fortresses would simultaneously attack from above, dividing the enemy's defensive fire between high and low threats and creating maximum confusion among the Japanese gun crews. On February 14th, reconnaissance photographs of Rabaul Harbour transmitted a shockwave through Allied Command Headquarters. The photographic imagery revealed 79 vessels crowded into the port facility, including 45 merchant ships and 6 large transport vessels clearly being prepared for a major operation. It became abundantly clear that a substantial convoy operation was imminent and probably just days away. 48 hours later, Ultra-intelligence, representing the top-secret Allied capability to decrypt and read Japanese encoded military communications, provided the absolutely crucial operational details. Naval codebreakers working in Melbourne and Washington had successfully decrypted Japanese message traffic, revealing that a major convoy would depart from Rabaul on February 28th, with Lai specified as the destination, carrying substantial reinforcements drawn from the 51st Division. The intercepted messages even specified the convoy's planned routing and estimated arrival date of March 5th at the destination. Kenny immediately recognized this intelligence windfall as the opportunity he had been preparing and waiting for, the chance to test his revolutionary new tactics in a decisive engagement that could alter the strategic balance in the theatre. He summoned his key subordinate commanders to Port Moresby for a final comprehensive planning session. Brigadier General Ennis Whitehead, serving as Kenny's deputy and commanding the advanced echelon forces in New Guinea, would coordinate the actual execution of the attack operation. The operational plan called for maximum effort commitment from every available aircraft in the theatre. 90 heavy bombers consisting of B-17 Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, 41 medium bombers, all B-25 Mitchells, 34 light bombers designated as A-20 Havocs, and 54 fighter aircraft, including P-38 Lightnings and P-40 Warhawks, would participate in the strike. In total, 219 aircraft would be thrown against the Convoy formation, representing the largest coordinated airstrike yet attempted anywhere in the Southwest Pacific Theater. The Allied pilots preparing for the mission experienced a mixture of excitement and genuine apprehension. Skip bombing remained an experimental technique, and many of the crews had never attempted it under actual combat conditions. Lieutenant Charles Howe of the 3rd Attack Group gave voice to the concerns many pilots felt privately when he observed that they would be sitting ducks coming in at such low altitude, where one lucky hit from a destroyer's guns could end their participation permanently. Major Ed Larner, who had been designated to lead the skip bombing attack, projected complete confidence in contrast. "We have trained extensively for this mission," he told the assembled crews. "Trust the plan we have developed. Go in fast, deliver your ordnance with precision, and get out. The Beaufighters will clear the way for our approach runs." Back at Rabaul, the Japanese convoy prepared for departure with meticulous attention to detail. Each transport ship was combat-loaded according to established doctrine, meaning that equipment and supplies were packed in reverse sequence of anticipated need, allowing for the most rapid possible unloading procedures once they reached Lai. The 5,954 soldiers belonging to the 51st Division's 115th Regiment boarded their assigned transport vessels, which included the Aiyo Maru, Kembu Maru, Nojima Maru, Oigawa Maru, Shinai Maru, Taimei Maru, and Teiyo Maru. An 8th transport designated Natsushima carried aviation gasoline and supplies desperately needed by the Japanese air units stationed at Lai. The destroyer escorts themselves would carry an additional 958 troops, packed into every conceivable available space aboard the warships. The human cargo included some of the Japanese Army's most senior commanders assigned to the New Guinea theatre. Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi, commanding the entire 18th Army, boarded the destroyer Tokitsukaze for passage. Lieutenant General Hidemitsu Nakano, commanding officer of the 51st Division, took passage aboard the Yukikaze along with his complete divisional staff complement. The concentration of such high-ranking leadership personnel within a single convoy operation was highly unusual and spoke volumes about both Japanese confidence in their destroyer escort capabilities and their desperation to get these commanders to Lai, where they were urgently needed to stabilize a deteriorating tactical situation. Admiral Kimura's operational plan for the convoy reflected lessons that had been learned at considerable cost from previous convoy operations in the theatre. Rather than taking the most direct route straight across the Solomon Sea, which would expose the convoy to air attack for the maximum possible duration, the formation would follow a longer northern routing. They would sail north from Rabaul initially, then turn west to follow along the northern coastline of New Britain, using the island's mountainous terrain to shield them from Allied radar coverage and provide some measure of protection from air attacks approaching from the southern quadrant. The final and most dangerous leg would take them south through the constricted waters of the Vitiaz Strait, followed by a dash along the Huon Gulf coastline directly to Lai. The strait itself, measuring only 50 miles in width at its narrowest point, would funnel the convoy into a completely predictable navigation path, where they would become most vulnerable to concentrated air attack. To provide air cover during the transit, the Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces stationed at Rabaul committed to maintaining 100 fighters on rotating patrol stations over the convoy throughout the voyage. This promise carried significant inherent problems, however. The distance from Rabaul to the Vitiaz Strait pushed the absolute extreme operational range for Japanese fighter aircraft. They could remain on station providing cover for only very brief periods before being compelled to return to base for refueling. Moreover, many of the Japanese pilots were physically and mentally exhausted from months of continuous combat operations, and their aircraft were increasingly worn out from constant use, with spare parts supplies reaching critically low levels. The harsh reality was that the convoy would have truly effective air cover for only limited portions of its voyage, rather than continuous protection. On the evening of February 28th in 1943, as tropical darkness descended over Simpson Harbour, the convoy began its departure sequence. One by one, in careful succession, the heavily laden transport vessels eased away from the dock facilities, their decks crowded with soldiers taking what many must have suspected in their hearts would be their final look at Rabaul. The destroyer escorts circled protectively around the forming convoy, their crews standing at battle stations despite being in supposedly friendly waters, as submarine attacks even this close to major bases were not unknown occurrences. Rear Admiral Kimura, standing on the bridge of the Shirayuki, watched his charges form into two parallel columns, with the destroyers taking up protective stations on the flanks and ahead of the formation. At precisely midnight, he transmitted the order for the convoy to proceed at 7 knots on course 350 degrees, heading into the darkness that lay across the Bismarck Sea. The first day of the voyage passed without any significant incidents. The weather conditions, so often the sailors' greatest enemy in these tropical waters, temporarily became their ally as two substantial tropical storm systems swept through the Solomon and Bismarck Seas, bringing low cloud cover and rain squalls that effectively concealed the convoy from Allied reconnaissance aircraft. The Japanese sailors and embarked soldiers, many already suffering from seasickness caused by the slow rolling motion of the overloaded transport vessels, nonetheless felt genuine relief with each passing hour that brought them steadily closer to their destination without being detected by enemy forces. Rear Admiral Kimura understood this favourable situation could not possibly last much longer, however. The weather systems were breaking up according to the meteorological reports, and tomorrow would most likely bring clear weather conditions, and with clear weather would inevitably come American bomber aircraft. His concerns were completely well-founded and justified. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon on March 1st, just as the convoy rounded Cape Gloucester at the western extremity of New Britain and executed its turn south toward the Vitiaz Strait, the cloud cover parted briefly. At that precise moment, a B-24 Liberator heavy bomber belonging to the 91st Bombardment Group and piloted by Lieutenant Walter Higgins was passing overhead on what had been intended as a routine reconnaissance flight. Higgins could scarcely believe his extraordinary good fortune as he carefully counted the ships passing below his aircraft. 8 transport vessels, 8 destroyer escorts, positioned exactly where intelligence assessments had predicted they would be at this time. He immediately transmitted the contact report that would set in motion one of the most strategically decisive air-sea engagements of the entire Pacific War. At 5th Air Force Headquarters in Port Moresby, the atmosphere transformed almost instantly to one of electric tension as Higgins's contact report was received and processed. General Kenny immediately ordered the execution of the attack plan they had rehearsed so carefully throughout the preceding weeks. A complicating problem existed, however. The convoy had been spotted somewhat earlier than the planning had anticipated, still positioned north of the Vitiaz Strait, where Japanese fighter aircraft operating from New Britain airfields could more easily provide protective cover. Whitehead made a critical tactical decision at this juncture. The initial attack wave would employ conventional high-altitude bombing techniques using B-17 Fortresses, designed primarily to inflict damage and slow down the convoy's progress. The decisive skip bombing assault would be held back until the following day, when the convoy would have progressed into the more constricted waters of the strait with substantially less room for evasive manoeuvring. On the morning of March 2nd, as the convoy continued its methodical journey through increasingly clear weather conditions, the first American attack wave developed. 28 B-17 Flying Fortresses approached at 6,500 feet altitude, maintaining tight formations despite persistent harassment from approximately 30 Japanese fighter aircraft that rose to intercept them. The Japanese transport captains, mostly civilian merchant mariners who had been pressed into military service, watched with horrified fascination as the massive 4-engine bombers released their bomb loads. Waterspouts erupted in towering columns all around the convoy as the majority of bombs missed their intended targets. but the statistical law of averages worked inexorably in the Americans' favour. The transport Kyokusei Maru sustained a direct hit amidships, broke into two distinct sections, and sank within a matter of minutes, taking hundreds of soldiers down with her. Another transport vessel sustained damage and began falling progressively behind the main convoy formation. Captain Sato Yasuo, commanding the destroyer Asashio and simultaneously serving as the overall commander of Destroyer Division 8, immediately manoeuvred his vessel to commence rescue operations for survivors from the sinking Kyokusei Maru. His crew succeeded in pulling nearly 700 soldiers and sailors from the oil-contaminated waters, cramming them into absolutely every available space aboard the destroyer. This humanitarian action, while certainly admirable from a moral standpoint, carried significant tactical consequences for the ship's combat effectiveness. The Asashio was now dangerously overloaded and substantially less maneuverable than normal, her fighting efficiency severely compromised by the mass of rescued survivors crowding her decks and passageways. As darkness fell across the area on March 2nd, Rear Admiral Kimura confronted a critical decision that would determine the fate of his entire convoy. The formation was still approximately 12 hours distant from Lai, but they had already lost one transport vessel and others had sustained varying degrees of damage. Should he continue at the slow speed necessary to keep the damaged ships in formation, maintaining convoy integrity but remaining vulnerable to air attack for a longer period? Or should the faster, undamaged ships race ahead at maximum speed, splitting the convoy formation but getting at least some portion of the troops to Lai more quickly? Kimura elected to keep the convoy together as a unified formation, a decision that would ultimately prove fatal for thousands of men. He transmitted a signal to all ships reading simply, "Maintain formation and proceed to Lai together." Unknown to Kimura at that moment, his decision and the radio transmission carrying it had been intercepted and successfully decoded by Allied intelligence services. Kenny and Whitehead now knew with absolute precision where the convoy would be positioned at dawn, its exact speed, its formation configuration. The stage had been set for the revolutionary attack that would permanently change the nature of naval warfare. That night, the Allied strike crews received their final mission briefings. The tension among the assembled air crews was absolutely palpable as pilots and gunners conducted final checks and rechecks of their aircraft systems. Many took the time to write letters to be sent home, understanding with clear-eyed realism that tomorrow's low-level attack profile would place them within point-blank range of Japanese defensive guns. Dawn on March 3rd in 1943 broke clear and calm across the Bismarck Sea, providing perfect flying weather conditions. The Japanese convoy, now navigating through the confined waters as it approached the Huon Gulf, maintained its steady 7-knot advance toward Lai, which now lay only a few hours distant. The surviving transport vessels had tightened their formation spacing, with the destroyer escorts circling them protectively in a pattern resembling sheepdogs guarding their flock. Rear Admiral Kimura had issued strict orders to all ships mandating rigorous anti-aircraft discipline, with no gun to commence firing unless specifically ordered by their respective captains, thereby conserving ammunition for the major battle he knew with certainty was approaching. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the first wave of Allied aircraft materialized on the horizon, but this formation bore no resemblance whatsoever to the high-altitude attack the Japanese forces expected based on yesterday's experience. 13 Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters belonging to No. 30 Squadron, led by squadron leader Claude Ridley, came screaming in at wave-top height, flying so low that their propeller wash left visible wakes across the calm sea surface. Behind them, clearly visible as dark specks against the morning sky, followed the B-25 Mitchell bombers of the 3rd Attack Group. On the bridge of the destroyer Arashio, Commander Hideo Kuboki possessed mere seconds to process what his eyes were seeing and formulate an appropriate response. His mind, trained and refined through years of naval service and combat experience, had to calculate multiple variables simultaneously and instantaneously. The speed and approach angle of the incoming aircraft, the inherent limitations of his anti-aircraft gun systems, which could not depress their barrels low enough to effectively engage targets at sea level, the absolute necessity of maneuvering his ship while simultaneously maintaining protective positioning for the transport vessels. Those precious few seconds available to him were simply not sufficient time to develop an adequate response. The Beaufighters were already upon his ship, their 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns unleashing an absolutely devastating storm of fire that swept across the Arashio's exposed decks with murderous effect. The Beaufighter attack proved devastating in its concentrated and focused violence. Cannon shells detonated among the anti-aircraft gun crews positioned on deck, killing or severely wounding most of them before they could bring their weapons to bear on the attackers. Machine gun fire raked systematically across the bridge structure, shattering windows and cutting down officers and signalmen indiscriminately. In a matter of seconds, the Arashio's ability to defend herself had been critically degraded to near worthlessness. The Beaufighters represented merely the opening act of this coordinated assault, however. Immediately behind them came the B-25 Mitchell bombers, each aircraft carrying 2 500-pound bombs equipped with 5-second delay fuses, their nose-mounted machine guns already blazing away at targets on the ships below. Major Ed Larner led the B-25 attack formation, his personally modified bomber nicknamed Betty's Dream, approaching the destroyer Shirayuki at precisely 220 miles per hour at an altitude of merely 50 feet above the water surface. Through his improvised gun sight, he could distinctly see Japanese sailors scrambling frantically across the deck below, some desperately attempting to man their gun positions, while others dove for whatever cover they could find. At precisely 300 yards range, Larner released both of his bombs and immediately pulled up sharply, clearing the destroyer's mast structure by mere feet with no margin for error. Behind his rapidly climbing aircraft, his bombs skipped across the water surface once, then twice, before slamming into the Shirayuki's hull plating just below the waterline with tremendous impact. The effect of the hits was absolutely catastrophic for the Japanese vessel. The bombs penetrated the destroyer's relatively thin hull armor before detonating inside the ship, their blast effect magnified enormously by the confined spaces of the interior compartments. The Shirayuki's stern section was virtually blown completely off the ship, her rear ammunition magazine detonating in a massive secondary explosion that sent debris and bodies flying hundreds of feet into the air above. Within a matter of minutes, Rear Admiral Kimura's flagship was visibly sinking by the stern, taking dozens of her crew members down with her into the depths. Kimura himself, wounded by flying shrapnel fragments, was pulled from the water by rescue personnel from the destroyer Shikinami. The attack developed and progressed with a choreographed precision that would have been beautiful to observe if it were not simultaneously so utterly deadly in its execution. As the Beaufighters and B-25 Mitchell bombers swept through the convoy formation at sea-level altitude, high above them, the B-17 Fortress bombers of the 43rd Bombardment Group released their bomb loads from 7,000 feet altitude. The convoy's anti-aircraft gunners, those who still remained alive and functional after the strafing runs, faced an absolutely impossible tactical choice. Should they engage the low-level attackers who posed the most immediate and direct threat to their ships, or should they attempt to disrupt the aim of the high-level bombers with their fire? Most gun crews chose the former option, filling the air with streams of tracer rounds and exploding shell bursts, but the B-25 bombers were moving far too fast and flying far too low for effective engagement by conventional anti-aircraft fire. Lieutenant Charles Howe, piloting his B-25 bomber affectionately nicknamed Chatterbox by his crew, selected the transport vessel Teiyo Maru as his primary target for attack. The ship, loaded with over 1,000 soldiers in her holds and on her decks, was desperately attempting to turn away from the direction of attack, her wake showing a spiral pattern as her captain tried frantically to present a smaller target profile to the attackers. At skip-bombing range and approach speed, however, such evasive maneuvers proved completely futile and worthless. Howe's bombs skipped perfectly across the intervening water, one striking the ship amidships while the other impacted near the stern section. The Teiyo Maru appeared to actually lift bodily from the water as the twin explosions tore catastrophically through her hull structure. Then she settled rapidly back down, listing heavily to port side. Within a mere 5 minutes from the moment of impact, she had completely capsized, trapping hundreds of soldiers helplessly below decks in her flooded compartments. The destroyer Tokitsukaze, carrying the precious cargo of Lieutenant General Adachi among her passengers, became the concentrated target of 3 separate B-25 bombers simultaneously converging on her position. Her commanding officer, Commander Masayoshi Motokura, attempted heroically to shield the nearby transport vessels by deliberately placing his ship between them and the approaching attackers, a genuinely brave gesture but ultimately completely futile against such overwhelming assault. Multiple bomb hits left the Tokitsukaze dead in the water with no propulsion, her engine rooms completely flooded, fires raging uncontrolled amidships consuming the vessel. General Adachi, remarkably and almost miraculously uninjured in the attack, was evacuated by small boat to the destroyer Yukikaze for transfer, but 19 members of the Tokitsukaze's crew were not nearly so fortunate, killed instantly by the bomb detonations and concentrated strafing fire. Commander Kuboki's vessel Arashio, already critically damaged by the earlier Beaufighter strafing attack, now faced the full attention of the skip-bombing B-25 bombers. One bomb struck and completely destroyed her steering gear mechanism, sending the destroyer into an uncontrolled turning circle that resulted in a collision with the transport vessel Nojima Maru. The two ships, locked together by the twisted and tangled metal of the impact point, became sitting ducks completely unable to maneuver for the next wave of attackers that followed. Both vessels were subsequently abandoned by their crews, personnel taking to the water in whatever lifeboats and rafts were available as fires consumed both ships progressively. In the midst of this widespread carnage and destruction, individual acts of remarkable heroism and unspeakable horror played out across the battlefield. Aboard the transport Kembu Maru, soldiers of the 51st Division, many of whom had never previously experienced actual combat conditions, struggled desperately to launch life rafts and lifeboats as their ship listed increasingly to starboard. Their officers, traditional swords drawn and held at the ready, attempted valiantly to maintain order and discipline among the panicking troops, but fear was spreading like wildfire as the grim reality of their situation became unavoidably clear to everyone. They were positioned hundreds of miles from the nearest friendly shoreline, floating in shark-infested tropical waters, with American aircraft systematically and methodically destroying any vessel that might potentially rescue them from their predicament. The destroyer Asashio, still dangerously crowded with survivors rescued from yesterday's sinking of the Kyokusei Maru, attempted to mount some form of effective defense against the onslaught. Her captain, Captain Sato Yasuo, who additionally served as the overall commander of Destroyer Division 8, ordered every single available weapon system aboard to open fire at the attacking aircraft, creating what amounted to a curtain of steel that momentarily caused several B-25 bombers to alter their approach courses. The weight of numerical superiority told the tale ultimately, however. A B-17 Fortress bomber operating high above the action, almost forgotten and ignored in the chaos and confusion of the low-level attack occurring below, succeeded in placing a 500-pound bomb directly onto the Asashio's forward deck section. The explosion, combined catastrophically with the hundreds of extra personnel crowding the ship beyond her normal capacity, caused rapid and uncontrollable flooding throughout multiple compartments. Captain Sato, remaining true to the ancient code of the samurai warrior tradition, made the deliberate choice to go down with his ship rather than abandon her. According to accounts provided by survivors who were subsequently rescued, his final words before the ship went under were simply, "I am tired and just wish to rest peacefully here." The Asashio sank with enormous and tragic loss of life, claiming not just members of her own crew but also many of the soldiers she had so heroically rescued from the water just one day previously. Captain Sato would be posthumously promoted to the rank of Vice Admiral in recognition of his heroic actions and ultimate sacrifice. By 10:15 in the morning, merely 15 minutes after the initial attack had commenced, the convoy had effectively ceased to exist as any kind of organized fighting force. 7 transport vessels were either already sunk or in the process of sinking, their leaking oil and scattered debris spreading across miles of ocean surface. Of the 8 destroyer escorts that had departed Rabaul with such confidence, 4 were now completely destroyed or damaged so severely they were fated to sink. The surviving destroyers, consisting of the Shikinami, Yukikaze, Uranami and Asagamo, circled desperately and frantically through the expanding field of wreckage and debris, their crews working frantically to pull survivors from the water before they succumbed to exhaustion, injuries, or the sharks that were already gathering in increasing numbers. There were simply too many men scattered across too much ocean, and far too few ships remaining to accomplish any comprehensive rescue effort. The second wave of Allied aircraft arrived over the battle area at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, finding a scene of almost unimaginable devastation spread out below them. Burning ships, massive oil slicks and floating debris covered several square miles of ocean surface. The remaining Japanese destroyers, still desperately engaged in pulling survivors aboard, were forced to completely abandon their humanitarian rescue efforts and concentrate solely on defending themselves against this fresh attack. The transport vessel Oigawa Maru, which had somehow managed to remain afloat despite sustaining earlier damage, was finally finished off and sent to the bottom by additional skip bombing attacks from this second wave. The destroyer Asashio, already resting on the ocean floor with Captain Sato and so many of her crew entombed within her hull, became a permanent war grave as oil continued to bubble steadily up to the surface from her submerged wreckage. As tropical darkness fell across the area on March 3rd, the complete and full scale of the absolute disaster became horrifyingly apparent to all involved. Of the 6,900 troops who had embarked at Rabaul with such hopes just days earlier, fewer than 1,000 would actually reach their intended destination at Lai. The destroyer escorts that had survived the onslaught, working continuously through the night under constant threat of submarine attack, managed to rescue approximately 2,700 men who would subsequently be returned to Rabaul rather than proceeding onward. Nearly 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors were confirmed dead, killed either in the actual combat action or drowned subsequently in the Bismarck Sea while awaiting rescue that never arrived. The carefully assembled reinforcement convoy intended to defend New Guinea had been utterly and completely annihilated in the span of a single day's military action. The immediate aftermath of the battle generated as much controversy as the engagement itself had been decisive in its outcome. On March 4th, American PT patrol torpedo boats and aircraft systematically patrolled the entire battle area, attacking essentially anything that remained afloat on the surface. The stated official justification for these actions was preventing Japanese troops from potentially reaching shore areas and thereby reinforcing the garrison at Lai. But many Allied aircrew members were genuinely sickened by what they personally witnessed as the unnecessary killing of helpless survivors who posed no immediate military threat. This moral complexity, representing the transformation of warfare from what had traditionally been understood as a contest between armed combatants into something approaching the wholesale destruction of human beings, regardless of their immediate combat status, would haunt many of the participants throughout the remainder of their lives. For the Japanese Navy as an institution, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented a fundamental and irreversible shift in the basic nature of naval warfare as they had understood and practiced it. Admiral Matome Ugaki, serving as Chief of Staff of the combined fleet, wrote in his personal diary with brutal honesty that they had lost the basic to move freely by sea within the operational range of enemy land-based aircraft, and that the convoy system, which had served as the absolute basis of their logistics support structure since the very beginning of the war, was no longer viable as a tactical option. Never again would the Japanese military attempt to reinforce their isolated garrisons using large convoy formations operating in daylight hours. From this point forward, only submarines and fast destroyer forces operating exclusively under the cover of darkness, missions the troops sardonically referred to as rat runs, would be employed for supplying isolated garrison forces. The tactical success achieved through skip bombing techniques revolutionized Allied anti-shipping operations throughout the entire Pacific theater of operations almost immediately. General Kenny's innovation, born directly from desperation and absolute military necessity, had conclusively proven that properly equipped and adequately trained land-based aircraft could control crucial sea lanes as effectively as any surface naval force could hope to achieve. Within a matter of months, skip bombing techniques were being actively employed in combat operations, ranging from the Solomon Islands all the way to the Philippine archipelago, making Japanese shipping movements increasingly hazardous and ultimately completely unsustainable over any significant distance. For Major Pappy Gunn, the primary architect of the revolutionary B-25 gunship modifications that had made the tactic so devastatingly effective, the battle represented simultaneously both a significant professional triumph and a deeply personal vindication of his engineering innovations. His family remained imprisoned under harsh conditions in the Philippines, and every single Japanese ship sent to the bottom brought their eventual liberation measurably closer to reality in his mind. He continued his relentless innovation efforts, constantly developing new weapons systems and tactical approaches that would make Allied aircraft progressively even more deadly and effective against Japanese shipping. North American Aviation, the manufacturing company that produced the B-25 Mitchell bomber, began incorporating Gunn's modifications directly into their production aircraft coming off the assembly lines, creating purpose-built gunship variants that would terrorize Japanese merchant shipping and naval vessels throughout the remainder of the war. The strategic implications and consequences of the Bismarck Sea disaster sent ripples throughout the entire Japanese military command structure at the highest levels. On March 25 in 1943, Imperial General Headquarters issued a new strategic directive explicitly prioritizing the defense of New Guinea positions over continued offensive operations in the Solomon Islands theater. Without the fundamental ability to reinforce and adequately supply their existing positions by sea transport, however, this directive was essentially meaningless rhetoric rather than actionable strategy. The Japanese garrisons stationed at Lae, Salamaua, and numerous other positions scattered along the New Guinea coastline were now effectively isolated and cut off, left to fight and die in their current positions without any realistic hope of relief or reinforcement. Lieutenant General Adachi, who had survived the sinking of the destroyer Tokitsukaze through remarkable fortune, eventually reached Lae with fewer than 1,200 troops, representing less than 20% of the total force that had confidently departed from Rabaul just days earlier. His 18th Army formation, already significantly under strength and poorly supplied before this disaster, would now be compelled to face steadily growing Allied forces without any hope whatsoever of receiving significant reinforcement or resupply. In his first official report transmitted back to Rabaul headquarters, Adachi stated with characteristic brevity and brutal honesty that the situation had progressed beyond recovery by any normal conventional means. His deeply pessimistic assessment would prove grimly accurate in subsequent months. Within approximately 6 months following the battle, Lae would fall to Allied forces advancing simultaneously by land and air in coordinated operations. The individual survival stories emerging from the battle aftermath proved both genuinely remarkable in some cases and utterly tragic in others. Captain Tamechi Hara of the destroyer Amatsukaze, which had not been assigned to participate in this particular convoy operation, subsequently interviewed numerous survivors and carefully recorded their harrowing experiences for posterity. One soldier belonging to the 51st Division described spending 3 full days clinging desperately to floating wreckage before finally washing ashore on a small island still held by Japanese forces. Of the 12 men who had initially started out together on that same piece of debris, only 3 ultimately survived the ordeal, with the others taken progressively by marauding sharks, complete physical exhaustion or simple despair and loss of will to continue. Such horrific accounts became increasingly common as survivors continued to trickle in sporadically over the following weeks and even months. Rear Admiral Kimura, wounded but alive and eventually recovered, faced no official censure or punishment from Japanese naval authorities for the convoy's complete destruction. The High Command recognized with clear understanding that he had faced an essentially impossible tactical situation for which no adequate response existed. He never commanded another convoy operation throughout the remainder of the war, however. The profound psychological impact of watching his entire force methodically destroyed in a matter of minutes by a revolutionary new form of attack that he could neither adequately anticipate nor effectively counter had broken something fundamental in this veteran officer's spirit. He spent the remainder of the war years assigned to various administrative positions, perpetually haunted by vivid memories of the Bismarck Sea disaster. The American pilots who had participated directly in the battle became instant legends throughout the Southwest Pacific Theater almost overnight. Major Ed Larner received the Distinguished Service Cross Medal in recognition of his exemplary leadership of the skip bombing attack. In private conversations away from official ceremonies, however, many of these same pilots expressed profound ambivalence and conflicting feelings about their victory and its execution. Lieutenant Charles Howe wrote candidly to his wife back home that they had destroyed the enemy completely and that he intellectually understood it had been militarily necessary, but that he could not erase from his mind the haunting sight of all those men struggling helplessly in the water. He confessed that this was not the kind of war he had imagined he would be fighting when he had enlisted. General MacArthur, ever the consummate showman with an acute understanding of public relations and propaganda value, issued a triumphant public communiqué claiming the destruction of 22 ships and 15,000 Japanese troops in the engagement. These figures represented wild and deliberate exaggerations of the actual results. Actual confirmed Japanese losses amounted to 8 transport vessels, 4 destroyer escorts, and approximately 3,000 men killed. The propaganda value of the exaggerated claims proved immense nonetheless, however. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was portrayed extensively in American media as revenge for the attack on Pearl Harbor, concrete proof that American innovation and courage could decisively overcome Japanese military might in direct confrontation. The reality of the situation, as invariably proves true in warfare, was substantially more complex and nuanced than the propaganda suggested. For the Australian military personnel who had participated in the battle, particularly the Beaufighter crews of No. 30 Squadron RAAF, the victory provided validation of their significant contribution to the overall Pacific War effort. Often overshadowed in media coverage by their more numerous American allies, the Royal Australian Air Force's absolutely crucial role in suppressing Japanese anti-aircraft defences had made the entire skip bombing attack operationally possible and survivable. Squadron leader Claude Ridley received the Distinguished Flying Cross decoration for his leadership, but similar to his American counterparts, he found himself troubled by the fundamentally one-sided nature of the engagement. It was not really a fight in any traditional sense, he later observed in an interview. It was more accurately described as an execution. The Japanese Army's institutional response to the disaster predictably focused on blaming the Navy for providing inadequate protection to the convoy, thereby rekindling the bitter inter-service rivalry that consistently hampered Japanese military effectiveness throughout the entire war. Army commanders argued strenuously that the Navy should have provided aircraft carrier support for air cover, conveniently ignoring the inconvenient fact that Japan's carrier forces were already stretched to absolute breaking point across multiple theatres. The Navy countered by asserting that the Army's stubborn insistence on conducting daylight convoy operations in the face of demonstrably overwhelming Allied air superiority amounted to nothing less than criminal negligence and dereliction of duty. This mutual recrimination and finger-pointing between the services effectively prevented any serious coordinated effort to develop effective counter-tactics to the skip-bombing technique that had proven so devastatingly successful. Within the broader strategic context of the Pacific War as a whole, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented a turning point equally as significant as the more famous engagements at Midway or Guadalcanal. It demonstrated conclusively and beyond any possible doubt that air power, when properly employed with adequate training and appropriate tactics, could control vital sea lines of communication as effectively as any surface fleet regardless of size. For island nations such as Japan and Britain, nations whose very existence depended fundamentally on seaborne trade and supply lines, this revolution in the nature of warfare carried absolutely profound implications for their future military strategy. The age of the battleship as the dominant naval weapon was rapidly ending. The age of the military aircraft had truly and irreversibly begun. The technical lessons extracted and learned from the battle drove rapid innovation and development efforts on both sides of the conflict. The Allied forces refined and perfected their skip bombing techniques even further, developing new specialized bomb sites and comprehensive training procedures that increased accuracy rates even beyond what had been achieved at Bismarck Sea. They simultaneously began experimenting extensively with rocket weapons and progressively larger bomb sizes, seeking methods to destroy even the most heavily armored capital warships through air attack alone. The Japanese military, belatedly recognizing the serious threat they now faced, attempted desperately to develop effective countermeasures, including barrage balloons, smokescreen generators, and specialized anti-aircraft ammunition specifically designed to engage low-flying aircraft more effectively. These defensive measures proved to be far too little effort applied far too late in the war to make any significant difference. Perhaps the single most poignant aspect of the battle's aftermath involved the families of those who had died in the engagement. Throughout Japan, where official casualty reports were heavily censored by military authorities to maintain public morale, many families waited for months or even years to learn the ultimate fate of their loved ones. A Mrs. Yamada, whose husband had been serving aboard the transport Teiyo Maru, received only a terse brief official notice stating that he had died gloriously for the Emperor in the South Seas Theatre. She never learned any of the specific details of his death, never knew about the terror of the skip bombing attack, the horror of the rapidly sinking ship, or the desperate struggle in oil-covered waters. Such enforced ignorance was perhaps ultimately merciful given the horrific reality. For the Allied codebreakers whose painstaking intelligence work had provided the crucial information that made the victory operationally possible, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea served as dramatic proof of their immense value to the war effort. The capability to successfully read Japanese naval communication codes provided the Allies with an essentially insurmountable strategic advantage, allowing them to concentrate their limited forces at exactly the right time and place for maximum effect. This success simultaneously carried its own inherent danger, however. If the Japanese command ever realized that their supposedly secure codes had been thoroughly compromised, they would immediately change their encryption systems, effectively blinding Allied intelligence overnight. Extreme care was therefore taken at all levels to make the battle appear to the Japanese as the fortunate result of lucky reconnaissance aircraft stumbling upon the convoy, rather than the product of sophisticated code-breaking operations. The propaganda war that followed in the immediate aftermath of the battle proved almost as intense as the physical combat itself had been. Tokyo radio broadcast claims that the convoy had successfully delivered its embarked troops to Lai with only minimal acceptable losses, asserting that American claims of a great victory were nothing more than laughable lies and enemy propaganda. The Japanese soldiers actually stationed at Lai knew far better than the propaganda suggested, however. They personally witnessed the pitiful remnants of what was supposed to have been their substantial relief force, and they understood with grim clarity that they were now truly isolated and on their own. Unit morale, already depressed from months of brutal jungle warfare conducted with inadequate supplies, plummeted even further following the disaster. In the government centres of Washington and Canberra, the Bismarck Sea victory was immediately seized upon as compelling evidence that the strategic tide had definitively turned in the Pacific theatre. Political leaders who had previously been deeply sceptical of MacArthur's ambitious plans for advancing through New Guinea and beyond now became enthusiastic believers and supporters. Critical resources that might otherwise have been allocated to other theatres of war were redirected to support the Southwest Pacific Campaign. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, in practical effect, validated MacArthur's overall strategic approach and ensured that the planned drive through New Guinea and eventually to the Philippines would receive the material support and reinforcements it desperately needed to succeed. The environmental impact of the battle, though receiving little consideration or attention at the time given more pressing military concerns, proved significant and long-lasting. Thousands of tons of fuel oil from the sunken ships spread progressively across the Bismarck Sea region, fouling beaches and delicate coral reef ecosystems for hundreds of miles in all directions from the battle site. The wrecks themselves, still laden with ammunition stores and military supplies, became permanent underwater tombs and significant environmental hazards that persist even to the present day. Modern underwater surveys of the battle area have revealed ships still sitting relatively upright on the ocean bottom, their cargo holds still partially full of military trucks, ammunition crates, and the skeletal remains of those who went down with the vessels and were never recovered. For serious military historians and strategic theorists, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea has become established as a classic case study in the evolution and revolution of warfare. It demonstrates compellingly the critical importance of tactical innovation, the immense value of accurate and timely intelligence, and the potentially decisive impact of air power when properly employed with appropriate doctrine. War colleges and military academies around the entire world continue to analyze the battle in detail, drawing important lessons about the fundamental vulnerability of surface ships to concentrated air attack, the absolute importance of achieving and maintaining air superiority, and the critical need for genuinely joint operations requiring close coordination between air and naval forces. The personal courage displayed by individuals on both sides of the engagement deserves full recognition and acknowledgement. Japanese destroyer captains who deliberately placed their vulnerable ships directly between the transport vessels and the attacking aircraft, knowing with near certainty that they were likely to die in the attempt. Allied pilots who flew directly into walls of concentrated anti-aircraft fire at point-blank range with no margin for error. Sailors on both sides who risked their own lives pulling survivors from oil-covered shark-infested waters under continuing threat of attack. War inevitably brings out the absolute worst aspects of human nature and behavior, but also occasionally and paradoxically brings out some of the very best qualities of courage and self-sacrifice. As the war progressed through subsequent years, the veterans of the Bismarck Sea battle found themselves scattered across the vast Pacific theatre to various assignments. Some participated directly in the island-hopping campaign that progressed methodically through the Solomon Islands and eventually to the Philippines. Others were transferred to training command positions, passing on the hard-earned lessons of skip-bombing tactics to new generations of pilots entering the theatre. A few individuals, completely burned out by the intense psychological stress of repeated combat, were sent back home to recover, carrying both physical and deep psychological scars that would never fully heal regardless of time passing. General Kenny progressed to even greater fame and responsibility, eventually commanding all Allied air forces throughout the Pacific theatre. Throughout his subsequent career, however, he consistently considered the Bismarck Sea his single greatest victory, the pivotal battle that conclusively proved air power could be genuinely decisive in maritime warfare, rather than merely a supporting element. In his personal memoirs written after the war, he described how the battle marked the definite beginning of the end for Japanese defensive positions throughout New Guinea. Within approximately 1 year following the engagement, most of their scattered garrisons had been either completely destroyed in combat or isolated and cut off, left to slowly starve in the jungle as the war and advancing Allied forces passed them by entirely. The grandiose dream of establishing a Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere under Japanese dominance died symbolically in the oil-slicked waters of the Bismarck Sea on that clear March morning. The technological revolution initiated and proven by skip-bombing tactics continued to evolve long after the war's conclusion. Modern anti-ship missiles fundamentally follow the same basic principle established at Bismarck Sea, employing high-speed, low-altitude approaches designed to avoid early detection and overwhelm defensive systems. The modified B-25 bombers of 1943, with their improvised gunship modifications and revolutionary skip bombing techniques, stand as the direct ancestors of today's sophisticated maritime strike aircraft. The fundamental lesson that innovation and rapid adaptation can overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges and obstacles remains equally relevant today, as it proved in those desperate days of 1943, when the outcome of the war remained genuinely uncertain. Ultimately, and in final analysis, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea is remembered quite differently by different groups of people based on their perspectives and experiences. For the Allied nations, it represents a genuine triumph of innovation and courage, dramatic proof that they possessed the capability to defeat Japan's finest forces in direct confrontation. For the Japanese, it stands as a profound tragedy that perfectly exemplifies the impossible situation they increasingly faced, consistently outnumbered, outgunned, and confronting an enemy whose technological and massive industrial superiority grew progressively stronger with each passing month. For the families of those who died on both sides, regardless of nationality or which uniform their loved ones wore, it remains simply a specific date when their entire world changed forever, when fathers, husbands, brothers and sons disappeared permanently into the vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean. Today, the Bismarck Sea itself remains peaceful and calm, its tropical waters plied routinely by commercial fishing boats and the occasional research vessel documenting and studying the numerous wrecks resting on the bottom. For those individuals who understand the detailed history, who comprehend exactly what transpired in these waters on March 3rd in 1943, these seemingly peaceful waters tell a profoundly different and more complex story. They speak eloquently of innovation born directly from desperation, of remarkable courage displayed in the face of near-certain death, of the terrible and cold arithmetic of warfare where success is measured clinically in ships sunk and lives lost. They remind us powerfully that behind every military innovation, every tactical triumph celebrated in history books, there exists a genuine human cost that can never be fully calculated or adequately repaid, regardless of the strategic benefits achieved.